In this lesson, I will update the Lesson 2 graph to write data to a relational database. To do this, I'll introduce the DBOutput table and Reformat components. This lesson has one additional prerequisite. I need to have access to a relational database with a target table already defined. In my case, I will use a Microsoft SQL Server database. I have already created a database called QuickStart and a table called Transactions, and I know the credentials for a user who has permissions to write to this database. I'll start by making a copy of my Lesson 2 graph and calling it Lesson 3. I want to change my graph such that instead of writing results to a spreadsheet, it writes results to a database table. To do this, I will replace the spreadsheet writer component with a DBOutput table component. The DBOutput table component is in the writers group of the palette. I can find it and drag it onto my graph. I'll reconnect this second edge to DBOutput and remove the spreadsheet writer. I need to provide the DBOutput component with connection information for the target database. I can double-click on DBOutput to bring up its property editor. The DB connection is the first property. I need to create a new connection. I'll call the connection QuickStart MS SQL. I know my username and password. Here is a list of database drivers that are pre-built into Clover. If necessary, I can easily add other database drivers using these controls. I need the Microsoft SQL Server driver. Selecting this will pre-populate the URL field with a connection string that I can easily edit. I need to change the host name to the machine where my database server resides. I can use localhost. And I need to specify the name of the database to connect to. QuickStart. I can click Validate to confirm I have established access to the database. Then I can click Finish. Now I need to select which database table to write the transactions to. The property is DB table. Clover will open the connection and allow me to browse for a table to write to. My table is Transactions. So I've replaced the spreadsheet writer with the DBOutput component and configured DBOutput to connect to my SQL Server database called QuickStart and write to a table called Transactions. I can save and run. And there is an error. The DBOutput component has a red exclamation mark, my console background is red, and the finish status is error, so something went wrong. I can double-click on the console tab name to temporarily bring the console full screen and take a closer look at the error messages. Clover is telling me there is an issue converting data from date-time to decimal. I need to give more consideration to the mapping between the fields in the input file and the fields in the database table. I'll double-click on the console tab name again to return the console to its original space. I remember now that the field names, their order, and their data types are different between the input file and my database table. The DBOutput component has a field mapping property I could use to fix this problem. I would simply need to map the input fields to the output fields. Clover would automatically take care of most type conversions. For this lesson, I will solve the problem in a different way, by explicitly defining output metadata and using the Clover Reformat component to define the mapping between input fields and database fields. I'll start with creating the metadata definition of the output data. Clover can generate this for me. The DBOutput component is already configured to connect to my table, so I can ask it for the metadata. I'll right-click on the component's Extract Metadata. I can choose the transactions table and create a new metadata definition that matches this table. I'll call this metadata transactions MSSQL. Now, as shown in the outline, this graph has two metadata definitions, one that describes the input data and one that describes the output. I can use a Clover component called Reformat to transform data from the input format into the output format. I'll drop a reformat onto the graph editor panel. I want to do this mapping after I filter. No sense in processing records I am just going to remove anyway. I'll move the DBOutput component to make some room. Then I'll drag the reformat over the edge. Note how the edge changes style when I'm on target. Clover inserts the reformat into the graph on this edge. Reformat's job will be to change the data from the input format to the output format. Data coming into Reformat will be represented by my input metadata. Data exiting this component, though, needs to have a new format, the one defined by my transactions MSSQL metadata. I will change the metadata definition on this edge to transactions MSSQL. So coming into Reformat is transactions CSV, leaving Reformat is transactions MSSQL. Now I need to configure the Reformat component to perform the mapping. A double click opens the property editor. I'll click here to open the transform property. On the left is the input metadata. On the right is the output metadata. I can define the mapping in the center. I can see that the name and order of the fields is different. I can also see I need to do a type conversion. Account number is of type string in the input and of type long in the output. For the fields that only have issues with order or name, I can define the mapping simply by dragging the input field and dropping it on the output field. For the account type, I also need to convert from string to long. There are conversion functions listed in the center that I can use for this. Here is string to long that will do what I need. I can drag that function into this area to create a new transform, then click on the input field, clean up the syntax a little, and then drag the output to complete the mapping. I'll also rename the component Convert to DB Format. I can save and run. And now I have successfully loaded this transaction data into a database. So, to recap Lesson 3, I made a copy of the graph we created in Lesson 2, replaced the spreadsheet writer with a DBOutput component, extracted some metadata from the database, mapped the input data format to the output data format, and wrote data to the database.